So now we go to the last two speakers in this block, Jessica de Abreu and Michael Karabinos. Jessica uses the pronouns she. Graduated from the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology and Culture, Organization and Management at Deviant at the University Amsterdam. Her passionate commitment to the fields of African diaspora led to researches on upward social mobility in New York, Amsterdam and London. Her recent research on organizational anthropology focused on social entrepreneurship in Black British communities from post- and decolonial perspectives. She's a board member of New Urban Collective and the co-founder of the Black Archives, which is one of the first historical archives in the Netherlands that focuses on Black Dutch history and beyond. And Michael Karabinos uses the pronouns he, is an archivist and archival theorist based in Amsterdam. He teaches archival studies at the University of Amsterdam and has been a research fellow at the vanabbemuseum since 2016. Michael received his PhD from Leiden University in 2015 and was a visiting fellow at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Combining questions on the nature of archives with their role in the decolonization of Southeast Asia, his work has been published in Displaced Archives, which is a publication from Routledge in 2017, Information and Culture, and Bijdrage tot de taal en land- en volkenkunde, and among others. And he's the co-editor of the book Colonial Legacy in Southeast Asia, Dutch Archives. Jessica and Michael will focus on the reconstruction, if I may call it like this, of the Gate Foundation archive, which was donated to the vanabbemuseum in 2006. Michael, do you need?
No.
No, you shield. Perfect.
Okay, good day everyone. My name is Jessica Abreu, and I'm recently working in the field of archives, but I actually have a background in anthropology, which makes it interesting for me to look at the social and cultural context of this organization, Gate Foundation, that we archived. So the Gate Foundation was established in 1988 in Amsterdam with the aim to stimulate the communication between Western and non-Western art. After its closure in the early 2000s, it was brought to the vanabbemuseum. So I will speak about the social cultural context for the first 10 minutes, and then Michael will take over and talk about more the archival work. So in the Netherlands, the Gate Foundation was an organization that aimed to bring non-Western art more to the foreground. In the first phases of the project, it was about more cultural awareness on Asian modern art. But later on, it became more a discussion about artists of color and their work in a society that structurally rejects them. So it started, for instance, with Indonesian modern art, but later on it developed into an exposition called This Is Not a Chinese Show, to explain how artists are being ignored or either being exoticized, or the exposition called What Am I Doing Here, which points out questions about notion of belonging. So thinking about the cultural and social context in the Netherlands, we often think that our new multicultural society has developed out of nothing, as if our society has no historical perspective which explains major social issues we are facing, such as social exclusion, discrimination, even in worst case segregation. So for example, the picture here on the slide is a demonstration in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, as you can see on the sign from 1963, which was led by a Surinamese community. So looking at this picture, this would mean that often we think we have new debates about our multicultural society, but actually these are old conversations and we are just uninformed. So going from the social context to the organizational context, understanding that history, having that history in the background, this would mean that artists of color constantly are facing problems with exclusions. So for instance, for example, in the archives of the Gate Foundation, you can recognize that certain debates, as you can see here on the slide, that we're having in 2018, 2019 even, we also had them in the 1990s. So, for instance, the call for people of African descent to have their own museums, or understanding culture from a non-dominant perspective, or also how the exclusion of artists of color and their works actually operates. But we can also learn about the end of the Gate Foundation, which I think is, for me, quite interesting, also as a business anthropologist. So how is such an organization established? But I also wonder if such an organization that reaches out for more diversity is also becoming more fragile during particular political climates, but also understanding, are there also still ways to survive these climates? Okay, so archiving is also personal history to me, because I met a lot of new artists and a lot of new names, a lot of interviews, a lot of photos, etc. So this research is really a beginning, and we still actually have a lot of questions around this archive, about the organization, about the people, about the artists, but also how were the archives organized. To go back to archival work and have some notes that Michael and I were basically discussing, but you will go further into the archive work. But these are some of the things that I thought about thinking about new ways of archiving. So for one, making the archivist more visible. So who archives the archive, and what are the choices that they make? And this is quite important to us, because archivists play a huge role, or a crucial role, in setting a foundation for other fields to do research. Number two, archives are time-specific, but they're also not fixed and static. There are always ways in which we can update those archives according to their time, but also according to their context. Number three, which is quite interesting, because we are here at the vanabbemuseum, a scene of art, the field of art. However, I think it's also interesting for different other fields to look into it in other disciplines. So for instance, for psychologists or business anthropologists as I am, or just other fields outside of the art scene who can look into the organization, paper, the administrations, etc. Another thing that I think is quite practical, also because I'm now working in this concept of community archiving and building different archives from non-dominant perspectives. A lot of things what you would see in more institutional archives is that they have limited space. Therefore, it is known that they cannot keep everything, right? So by seeking collaboration with other organizations, what might not be useful for their archives or for one organization can be always a treasure for another one. So these are one of my last notes.
Okay, I'm going to take over and talk a bit more about the practical side of what we physically did in the archive, and also hopefully ask a few more questions along with the ones that Jessica started to ask. So this is essentially what the Gate archive looked like when we arrived a year ago. It was in these moving boxes. I think there were 18 moving boxes in the hallway of the basement of the museum. Two of the moving boxes actually had material that belonged to the museum and were not part of the Gate Foundation. So the first question that asks is, were the archives that were in here placed somewhere else? Because part of the archive was already started to be cataloged and put into the museum's archive. So did they reuse these boxes and start putting things from the museum into these boxes, and then put them back on the shelves where they looked like the Gate Foundation archive again? That's not exactly clear. So that's the first question that came up, is what was even this archive? Where is it? Where does it begin and where does it end? So we had these 16 or 18 boxes, whatever you want to say, and started opening them. Yeah, so this one you can see it was somewhat organized, but the organization of the archives was completely hit or miss depending on which box we opened. And that was really part of what we were doing, was being involved in these sort of silent conversations between us and the people of this archive, the artists who were exhibited by the Gate Foundation, previous archivists at the vanabbemuseum, if they had cataloged some of it, staff members of the Gate Foundation. We were essentially working with their organizational system. So there were cases where, for instance, this one, where if it was organized well enough and there were notes saying, behind this folder is everything related to this exhibition, and then when we looked at it and that was the case, we weren't going to question that, or we weren't going to upend everything. So this reconstructing of the archive, we were, in some cases, had to make our complete own organizational structure if there was none whatsoever, and then sometimes we went along with what the Gate Foundation did. So we were making these decisions pretty much depending on how the box was that we opened, whether we were going to go with what they had set as their structure or we were going to make something else on our own. And sometimes they drew drawings on the folders. So this kind of also gets into this idea of what is in an archive and what gets left behind, because traditionally you would take everything out of these binders that you could see where the box were filled and put them into the folders of the vanabbemuseum archive, and that would be how you would do it, how you would archive something. But this is what you miss even in an archive, is what's behind the folders, what's written directly on the folders sometimes. So this is something that would normally just be tossed and lost, as the rest of them will be, but sometimes you find some little gem written on it. So yeah, this sort of idea of, like Evelyn said, that an archive is just what's kept in the end. So there's plenty of things that aren't always kept that yeah, should be for whatever reason. So sometimes they were organized and well structured, sometimes it's just a bunch of stuff in a box. So we would open up the box and try to make sense of what it was. These slides, there's one LP, there was a handful of floppy disks, there was a few DVDs and CDs, so the actual material of what the archive was also pretty diverse in terms of what it was. But these slides, yeah, there's so upstairs in our exhibition space, we have a slideshow showing some of these slides. And that also gets into some more of these gaps and questions that have come up in this archive. So a lot of these slides are organized by artist, but sometimes that's unknown. And sometimes there's a piece of paper on one page of slides that just says, country known, artist unknown. So you're left with a page of slides that says Philippines, Zambia, Indonesia, and an unnamed artist. So upstairs you'll see some of these slides on being exhibited, so we thought that we could give a bit of an opportunity for these unnamed artists to be in the museums for at least this weekend. Let's see, this is sort of our midway point, where we're about half moving boxes, half into the archival boxes. So this was the process we were going in, of just going through one box at a time, trying to make sense of it, starting to organize all the different exhibitions that the Gate Foundation had done. And here's a little bit further on as we added more archival boxes. You can also see that the archival boxes don't always match. That's because we didn't have all the boxes that we needed to, as we realized that as more and more was coming out of these moving boxes, so we needed more and more archival boxes. So the brown ones are recycled or reused archival boxes that we got out of storage and had to bring down to our space in the basement. And these were temporary boxes. So that's also was something fun for us, to have these sort of temporary holding places for archives, and to see how what you see in the end of as a finished archive and what you think of as something that's set in stone, or like you said, some people would have that perception of static. Even as we're doing the archiving, it's this constant motion that's happening, and we're moving the boxes. We're moving things from one box to another box to a third box in some cases, and that's just the nature of this movement that an archive is, and it's never something that sits in one place. In terms of what else we found, and these questions of what is it that we're even looking at, what have we found, these drawings, there's about 100 of them, of these pencil drawings, with no real information on them. They just came out of a folder that was completely unlinked to what was next to them. So that was just a huge question mark for the first half of our research. Then we started looking at photos from an exhibition that was held in Indonesia called Orientasi, which was half Indonesian artists and half Dutch artists, and they had some workshops and some you can see we found this photo of one of the Indonesian artists doing this workshop in Bandung, Indonesia, and these drawings that we had been looking at for months showed up on the floor of his photo. And you can even see some of the exact drawings in the photos of these sort of connections finally came together in the course of the research as to what we were even looking at. The other sort of fun thing for us was to go through floppy disks and see what we could still access. So these were 20-year-old floppy disks that, sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, but it also gave you this sense of what the technology of only 20 years ago was like, where this was the only thing that would be on a floppy disk. So when you're trying to talk about sending your work to the gallery to have it exhibited, you're sending 4 floppy disks just to get a handful of photos sent to them, or a handful of images. And this image is from a Keith Piper exhibition from 1998 that was held at the Gates Foundation. So you can see that from some of the metadata, where it says it was created in June 2018, but that's when I would have saved it separately. But you can see the modified date of 1998. So that was, this file that took, just one floppy disk was all that, this was all that it could fit. The other thing that I wanted to talk about that we display upstairs as well is this idea that the anthropologist Ann Stoller talks about, which is called the archival event, and she looks at this through what she calls a thickening of the archive, and that when you can see in an archive a massive amount of paper for something must have happened there, and whether it's a historical event or not, it's some sort of archival event, and something caused this massive thickening of the archive in one spot compared to those around it. And what we saw time and time again was the difference between the exhibitions set up by the first director of the Gate Foundation, Els van der Plas, and the second director, Sebastian Lopez. And that was what Jessica was speaking about when she introduced the Gate Foundation. When it started, it was this very geographical-based Asian art by artists in Asia, and that was during the period of Els van der Plas. That was her background, was in an interest in Asian art, and so that's what she was exhibiting, was exhibitions such as Indonesian modern art. And this exhibition took 4 years of research, and it has a massive amount of paper and research that was done, trips to Indonesia that her and the other staff members took trying to find artists for it. And so we're left with an entire shelf worth of Indonesian modern art exhibition. Then you get to the Sebastian Lopez period in the late 1990s, so this period during this Keith Piper exhibition, 1998 or so, and we could fit 4 or 5 exhibitions into one archival box. So he was doing much more one after the other exhibitions, not doing as much of the preliminary research as Els did, but putting out artists of color in the Netherlands and putting them on display in the Gate Foundation. And this was what he was all about, and he was trying to get as many artists, as many exhibitions a year as possible, compared to the old style of spending 4 years to make a sort of massive exhibition. So you can really see that, not just if you know the history of the Gate Foundation, but you can see it physically in the archive when you see these 4 boxes for Indonesian modern art and then 1 box of 4 exhibitions from the late period. So that was sort of that visualization of the archive also gives you a bit of its history. But the thing about archives is also to sort of remember at the same time to not have this sort of fetishization of the archive, and that you're not going to get every answer you're looking for, and that there's still left with many questions, and even just these foundational questions about the Gate Foundation in terms of what was going on between 2000 and 2003, where we have no papers from at all in the archive. Was funding cut and they had to cut back on exhibitions? We don't know. Did someone who was working there during that time take it home when they saw the writing on the wall and knew that they were going to close down soon and took some of the archives home? That's not clear either. It picks back up in 2004 for one of their largest exhibitions, so it's very strange that there's this sort of 3-4 year gap where we just found nothing. So there's still these holes in the history of the Gate Foundation that are not unique to this archive at all. You're always going to be left with these holes, and an archive is sort of not necessarily this place where answers go to be found, but you end up finding more questions to be asked and more research to do further. So that's where we left off.
shall we share one microphone or?
Thank you very much, Michael and Jessica. For me, it's really exciting to hear that you think of the archive as a very dynamic thing, not a static thing. And you were talking about the possibility to add information or to deal with it as a living thing, and that's quite interesting for me, who deals with archives that are quite static. Especially here in the museum, we have rules that you have to deal with, and when it's in the archive, you can't change or add or whatever. When I'm allowed to ask the first question, for you, Michael, how would you, do you have advice for us in your application? You were talking about a kind of toolkit or suggestions for users how to use this archive. Did you work on that, or?
It was something that we thought about. I think one of the first things is this, even archives that appear static are never static. Every two people that go into an archive experience it differently and see something differently, and that is part of this sort of recreation of the archive. And every time you can read the same paper two different ways each time you go in there, so that also sort of keeps the archive alive, and it's how a different person reads the same thing and how a different person can use the same thing, that we're always sort of reimagining what's there, and it's always in this sort of amorphous space, everything that we're going to be looking at, everything that we saw while we were there, it's being used a different way when we go in and look at it than how it was the first time. So it's never going to sit in a sort of static way, because the next person that goes in after us, now that we've made it organized and made it for someone to go in and do research, they might bring a completely new perspective and look at it in a completely different way. So all that changes every time someone looks at an archive. So in terms of the toolkit that we developed was just that sort of mindset of how you go into an archive and what you're thinking about as you enter it, and how you can transform it into whichever way you want.
So that could very well be added to the archive, the results of these readings.
Yeah, that was one thing that we were interested in, of sort of how to know how future users use an archive, and sort of leave this space for how does the next person go in and use it, and how does it continue to evolve, because it's in general, if you go into an archive and look at something, you have no idea if someone else looked at it and what they did with it. So it would be really interesting to be able to continue this archive as something living and growing, and be able to share with how it gets used.
Yeah. Question for Jessica. You talked about interest from totally different disciplines, and you also talked about, or you asked the question, is this the right space for this archive, because institutions usually don't have a lot of space. Do you have suggestions for us?
Yeah, so it was not necessarily that, but what I can suggest, like I mentioned in the fourth point, is that institutional archives have limited spaces, physical spaces, so we cannot fit all of it, but seeking for different collaborations, something that might not be useful or the focus of your archive can be really a treasure for another organization, or even going back to the artists or even their families. So we can share these different collaboration and not just focus on actually the archive, but the narrative that we want to tell, and keep them complete. Yeah.
Oh, wow, this is a challenge, can be a challenge for a lot of organizations and researchers in the future. Are there questions?
I was curious about the point that you just made, actually. In your understanding of the Gates archive in relation to other archival work, to understand the place of people of color in the broader Dutch context, was the archive, or have the other archives you've been looking at inclusive of artists' perspectives, or is this actually something that's separate? within the broader context of archiving blackness and experiences of people of color in Dutch context.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think also because I have 10 minutes, I was not sure if I can fit the whole story. So the thing about the Gate Foundation, it started, like I said, with cultural awareness, that they wanted to bring Asian art more to the foreground, especially under the direction of Els van der Plas. And then when the second director came, Sebastian Lopez, it was more about, okay, so before we talk about, for instance, the Indonesian artists in Indonesia, but we overlooked that the Indonesian artist is also right here in the Netherlands. So that became the prime focus. So for me, it was quite interesting talking about that broader context, because it's not only in the Gate Foundation, it's actually in also other fields of culture organization, heritage organization, that there was a particular time that there was a lot of cuts in funding that meant actually an end of these narratives which are actually needed to understand social issues, like I said, migration, social exclusion, the discrimination, and even the segregation in worst case scenario. So I was interested if the Gate Foundation was part of that line of history of where organization, no matter what field, there was an ending to that organization due to a particular climate, political climate. And if that was true, how can we learn from that history in order for them to survive? Because these are still organizations who want to give broader voice to marginalized groups in general. So I thought that was also for me quite interesting to look at, okay, so what can we learn from this and what can we take to the future? Yeah.
Thanks a lot for, also for all the work that you did in putting, in getting this far. I have two questions actually. One of which is you more or less answered now, which is there much evidence of the end of the Gate Archive in the archive itself, the end of the Gate Foundation in the archive itself? And the other thing is, we're not going too far back in time. So what about oral history? And should we be looking at doing interviews with both directors are still alive and things like that?
Yeah, that was something that the oral history side of it was something that we had thought about, and taking, if there was a phase 2 to the project, or what to do next with the archive. Then oral history with the directors, but also artists, to see what did they see as the Gate Foundation's legacy and how they see it as relevant today. And the first question of, did we see evidence of the end days by the end? Not really in terms of so direct, I think, in terms of, it just sort of ends, at least the way I looked at it, but there was
actually a surprise, because in the archive you see 2 directors, but then we did an interview with Sebastian Lopez, and there was actually a 3rd director, I guess, tried to say, I don't know, it's an interpretation, tried to save it maybe, and that was one of the most loyal artists that I see in the archive, which was Bülent Efren. I'm not sure if I can pronounce it right. So yeah, oral history could also be definitely a tool to fill in those gaps. What happened, for instance, at the end.
Yeah, but otherwise there's the...
Because the chaos, as I understand, because I was involved when it came here and why we picked it up. One of the reasons for the chaos, as I understand it, is that things had to be packed very, very quickly, because it was really like a sort of deportation process in a way, that they were being thrown out of the building at very short notice.
Yeah, and that's why you get the moving boxes in the hallway, is that it there are no letters from 2005 or 2006 saying, and a reminder that we're closing down next year or something like that. So there's not too much evidence of the funding being cut or anything like that. It is something that just sort of quickly takes place. I think there's some letters between the museum and the Gate Foundation, which sort of work out the specifics of the donation, and those are pretty fascinating. There's some of the, I wouldn't call them demands of the Gate Foundation, but what they say is involved is also this sort of continuation of the Gate Archive, and that was something that we had thought about. Their archive, one of the main parts of their archive was the artist archive, and so it does have a special place as for artists of color in the mid-90s to 2003, but then it's just cut off. And so there's now 15, 16 years of it not growing and artists not sending in material to the Gate Archive and having it grow and grow and grow as it had in the 90s and early 2000s. So that is something that's also sort of something where the archive is sort of also just cut off. So there is no, there's not much in terms of it at the end, in terms of why this was happening.
Other questions?
Sorry, last remark, and it's more of a realization, I guess. The work that you guys have done is in a way, it was the work that should have happened 10 years ago when the archive came to the vanabbe. And it was really, it's the work that allows research to happen. Because, this project with you came out of us inviting another researcher, Susan Puisen-Locke, to work with the archive and her realizing that, you can do so much with material in removal boxes, but beyond that, you can't get very far. So I think it's really for us important now to think about what do we do with this archive? Does it stay here? Does it somehow disperse in other places, like you were suggesting, Jessica? What do we do with some of the material? There's artworks, DVDs from many artists, stuff that was sent that was never given back. The status of this material, I think we need to ask some really important questions about what it means to have that now, when it's just been sitting in boxes for so long. So just to really, say that this is a first step, actually, and a second step in a process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael and Jessica.